Welcome everyone to our special screening of Art 21 Borderlands episode. My name is Dr. Lane Little. I am the director of the Pauly Friedman Art Gallery. And we are, if you are not from the Misericordia community, we are broadcasting from Dallas, Pennsylvania. That's in Northeast Pennsylvania, Misericordia University. I just want to preface this by saying that Misericordia University is an institution of the Sisters of Mercy, and as such, we are concerned with the critical concerns, one of those being the refugee crisis around the world, which is why we are screening tonight's Art 21 episode, Borderlands, which focuses on the US-Mexico border. With us today is a guest speaker, Sandra Lauterbach. She is a textile artist, and her work will be in the gallery in the spring with our exhibition called Forced to Flee, which is about the worldwide refugee crisis. So she's going to tell us a little bit about her practice and how her personal family history inspired her to participate in the show that we're having in the spring. So Sandra, if you'd like to introduce yourself and introduce your work. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Dr. Little, Dr. Cormack, for inviting me. I'm a textile artist living in Southern California, and textiles is my favorite medium versus paint. And that might be partially explained by the fact that my family was in the textile business for over 4 generations, from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to Poland, and finally to the United States. So fabric has always been a part of my world. The theme of this exhibit, Forced to Flee, strikes a strong chord with me because of my family history. Both sides of my family lived in Krakow, Poland until World War II broke out. Miraculously, on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, neither was in Poland. My mother and grandmother were in Paris. They eventually made their way to Lisbon and finally got visas to the United States and landed in New York via Ellis Island. They were able to get visas because the Polish quota was not filled, because Poles were not able to leave Poland. My father was in New York for the 1939 World's Fair, and he was able to get his family out via Siberia and Japan. And he met them when their ship docked in San Francisco on the first night of Passover in 1941. And as you may know, Passover is where Jews celebrate the Exodus, the freedom from slavery from Pharaoh. So for my family on that evening, it was truly an exodus from slavery. So I'd like to start showing some pieces and explaining. So let's see. Okay, so this is, so I said my family's from Krakow. This is a photo of Krakow, the center square, which I took when I visited there. Krakow's a beautiful medieval city, and it was not destroyed by the Germans because they made it their headquarters. So when I was in Poland, it's skipping one, but okay. I went to the Jewish cemetery. It is one of the oldest cemeteries in Europe. It's from the 1500s, and it was destroyed by the Nazis. In the 1950s, they tried to restore the cemetery. And so the tombstones that were large enough to resurrect were resurrected, and you can see them in this photo. And please note the stones on the tombstones, because I'll explain why they are there in another piece. So when you walked into the cemetery, you saw the wall, which was actually made of stone. It went around the cemetery, and it encompasses 2 sides of the cemetery, and it is made of the fragments of tombstones. They were too small to resurrect as tombstones, so instead they were cemented in the wall in order to save them. Here you see the wall itself, and here is a close-up of the wall. And you have to remember these were, represent people who were loved by their families. And if you note in this one, in the center of is a stone with a deer and a portion of a circle around it. And you'll see it in one of my pieces because my father's Hebrew name meant deer. So I knew I'd make a piece based on this is the entry to the cemetery. And then, let me, these for some reason are out of order. But this is the piece I made from my trip. It is over 8 feet wide, and you can see it's quite large. Here it is on exhibit at the Quilt Festival in Houston, where over 60,000 visitors came. And I was by my piece and explaining it. I'm hoping the rest come in order. Okay, let me go back a second and let me reorder this. So hold on a minute. So this is the piece I made. And I made it I took photos of different sections of the wall that had meaning for me. And I collaged them in Photoshop. And you can see in the center, the piece I mentioned, which has the deer on it and that portion of a circle. And I collaged it in Photoshop and I sent it out to be printed. And then I layered it so that the batting would be thick, because I know, in Pennsylvania, you have a long time quilt tradition and would know the batting is what's in between the front and back of a quilt. And I stitched it mainly by machine, but you will see some hand sewing. And amazingly, a lot of family World War II documents and photos survived. And I scanned them and they are on this piece. I'm sorry, they're a bit out of order, but it'll still work. This is Generation to Generation, which is the piece that will come to you in the Forced to Flee exhibit. And it's made with the same process. There are different documents on it. And I wanted to point out the yarn at the bottom, the white yarn. It's to represent the string that is traditionally on a Jewish prayer shawl. And this is a close-up of the piece. And I mentioned that to note the stones that were on the Jewish tombstones. If you look at the square below the one that has a white cloth rectangle, there are 2 buttons sewn in, and that is to represent the stones that are traditionally put on a Jewish grave. And you think usually of flowers, but flowers are transitory, and the stone lasts longer, and it's that our memories last longer. The other explanation is that it's to weigh down the souls so they stay in the ground and do not wander among the living. In this picture, you can see on the left, it's the ribbon from my grandparents' wedding menu. And on the right, my father, who was the oldest of 3 boys, with his 2 brothers. And I tried stitching sometimes in the sense of a Hebrew alphabet, or emphasizing the depth in this picture. Okay, this again is that piece, the big wall. And then this is a close-up of that 8-foot wide piece. And you can see in it, to the upper right is a Polish passport. And you can see the hand stitching in that and in the open passport below it. I don't usually do hand stitching, but I felt these works needed it because otherwise they were too harsh. And it's to remind us that the survivors had to piece their lives together after the war. And they lost their homes, their hearth and family. And this hand stitching, to my mind, brought warmth to the piece. The portion of the letter you see in the upper left quadrant is that my father joined the US Army, and he wrote daily to my mother, who was at New York Medical College, and he numbered his letters. So this was number 139 from January 5th, 1945. And he writes about his experiences. And well, on the right, you can see his croix de guerre. And the two photos in color are of our sons, and they represent our hope for the future. Okay, let me see if the next piece is the one I want, actually. Let me see. Yes, so this one, my father's family, as I said, came by boat to the US, and so they would have had steamer trunks. And that is what this piece represents. I made it to look like a steamer trunk. You can see the metal locks at the top, which I tarnished so they would look older, and putting leather in the corners, and the straps so you hold, so the bag stays together and doesn't open. I did the same process of finding documents and collaging them. On the bottom left corner is a photo of my grandmother as a little girl with her parents, and her father would have been in the Austrian-Hungarian uniform. On the upper right are my grandparents. They were actually in different photos, and I combined them. And the colored backgrounds at the top right, the bottom right, are photos that I took visiting Krakow, and I visited the buildings that had been the homes of each of my parents' families. And in the close-up is a picture of my father as a baby, and to the right, the letter is my grandfather wrote daily to my grandmother when they were in the US in English because she wanted to learn English. And he talked about the war. And in this one, he's mentioning the White House and Roosevelt meeting Churchill. And I was very impressed, at his writing, his English ability and his script. On the left is one of my father's army patches and the French Croix de Guerre. And under the lock are headlines from a much more recent newspaper, which said "Never Again," which was printed after the bombing of Jewish areas in France in the recent past. So we know the anti-Semitism still exists. This is all right. We're a bit out of order. So this was a piece I made, which led to other pieces. It's obviously a peacock, and it is using fabrics that were in my family business, probably around the 60s and the 70s. They mainly designed and sold cottons. So these were samples they got of brocades and other fabrics from France when they were thinking of adding that to their line. And when making this peacock, I made patterns for each of the feathers. And so when I finished it, I felt I wanted to work intuitively and not make a pattern. So that is what led me to my freeform abstract pieces. For example, this is one of my freeform pieces. It's called Red Jasmine. And the way I do them is I take a piece of fabric that intrigues me, and I have cut out an unusual shape, put it on my design wall, and then look for another piece that sparks a dialogue with it. Is it a lively conversation? Is there no conversation? And I keep adding and subtracting pieces in that way. And sometimes the most unusual fabrics work together. I'm sorry, somehow the detail shot probably will come later. This is Blink. It's unusual for me in that it's a black and white. And from this piece, I learned not to give very specific names. I want it to be general names that, because I found my pieces are like Rorschach tests. People see different things. I saw a dancer, but the first person who saw it saw Ganesh, the elephant in it. Someone else saw a man with his wife's head leaning against his shoulder. When I do black and white work, I tend to always add a little bit of red. And this actually has 2 places of red. And when we get to the close-up, you'll see I did not just use fabric. This is the close-up. You can see in the upper right and in the bottom left, I was using fiberglass mesh. And there's canvas in it, and there is a lot of stitching. Stitching is my way of making a mark. It's, it's a century-old tradition of mark making, and I feel it adds structure and can unite a piece. This is the detail shot of Red Jasmine, and you can see the stitching, particularly on the green on the right-hand side. I view fabrics as my paint, and the stitching is like my brush strokes. And sometimes I work within the pattern, other times I superimpose my stitching. This is an Asian looking piece, which for my work is on the darker side. As I said, these pieces have energy, and I didn't want to confine them in a rectangular shape. So then it is, sometimes it becomes difficult to figure out how to hang them. I like that they have negative space. This is a close-up, and you can see the stitching, particularly in the coral and yellow on the left-hand side. And there is a lot of detail stitching in the navy on the right. This is my work table. And as you can see, I usually work with color, and it gives me a broad range of paints to work with. This is going back to my other technique. And I was asked to participate in an exhibit titled, the subject was What Matters to Me. And I chose history because, as what George Santayana said, if we don't learn about history, we're condemned to repeat it. So this piece has various historical sites in it. If you look, let's say, at the upper left, you see the Sphinx. And then you'll recognize on the top left what you see from the United States. And the wall, as you move along, is from Krakow. The stones are photos I took in Israel at Masada, which is where the Jews fought the Romans. The brick building on the right is from Volubilis in Morocco, which was the westernmost post of the Roman Empire. The headlines on the right are the Japan opening war on the US. So there's a lot of fighting in these historical pieces. Below the headline, you'll notice a photo which looks like people boarding a train. And then the corresponding photo is at the bottom left, which is the Nuremberg trials, which were held by the Allies after World War II, where Nazi officials were tried for war crimes. So one would think the train is Jews being loaded and sent to concentration camps. But actually that photo was taken in the United States. It's the Japanese who are often US citizens being sent to internment camps. At the bottom right, the people that you can see, it's Reverend Martin Luther King and Rabbi Heschel, and there's also a nun marching in one of the civil rights marches. In the big item in the middle is a Hanukkah. It's used at Hanukkah when the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, and it celebrates a fight for victory with the Maccabees, and also that the eternal light, which ran out of oil, that only had oil for one night, miraculously burned for 8 nights until they were able to get new oil. And this actually is an oil Hanukkah. And then I just want to mention on the left are words from Haile Selassie, who was the regent and emperor of Ethiopia. And he said, throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most, that has made it possible for evil to triumph. And I think that quote is still applicable today. And this is going back, this is that piece, and you see the Trojan horse and refugees. And I hand quilted the sky, and the bricks are all quilted to make them pop out. And I think, and I'm going to just go quickly through this piece was at the Festival of the Quilt in London, and it is now on exhibit at the Oceanside Museum of Art. And that is a close-up. This is actually a current piece that I've just finished, and it's a progression. I went from the peacocks to those free-form abstracts, and now these have become even more free-form and loose, and are tied together. And I view this as fragments from the past, kind of archaeological remnants and layers of civilization. And then I think we're back to the beginning. So we're back to the beginning. And I'm glad to answer any questions, and I hope you found it relevant.
Wonderful. We do have, are you able to see the question box, Sandra?
I see the chat room. Is that Q&A?
Yeah, so if you click on that, you'll be able to see the
question. Can you speak to the transferability of fabric? Okay.
And I'll repeat the question. So the question is, can you speak to the transportability of fabrics, especially as they relate to migration and family legacy?
Well, fabrics are obviously more easily transferable than, heavy objects. I think when you think of immigration, I think for most people, that's going to be the clothes on their backs. And so I do not really have fabrics from those times. From my viewpoint, I have fabrics from the family business. So it's kind of, I know my father, my grandfather may very well have touched and handled the fabrics I work with. So that brings more meaning to me when I work with it. And did that answer the question? I hope.
So one of the things that I just want to point out, especially for the art history students, is that we teach textiles as ways of transferring information. In terms of refugees, the textiles are the only things that people have when they can't come over the border, and they carry memories and they carry techniques of clothing making, very culturally specific techniques. And so I'm glad you're honoring that tradition by bringing your techniques to this show. Are you able to see the next couple of questions?
I don't know if everyone knows, it's what has been the most rewarding part of being an artist for you? Um, I think it's the ability to express myself and when I get a reaction of people from my work. Um, whether it is a joyful ones and people who have them in their homes, when they tell me they wake up in the morning and it makes them so happy to see it, or a therapist who tells me his patients look at them and comment how it calms them or it makes them feel happier. So I think when I can evoke an emotion from people, and for example, these pieces that dealt with World War II, when I was exhibiting them and when I'm at the exhibit, people come up to me and tell me their stories and their experiences. Or when they've been on exhibit, I hear from curators whether people actually will cry in front of them or people get a response. Some people, a friend said she was emotionally, felt so emotional, even though she did not know the history, did not really know what they represented. So that is satisfaction. There's also rewarding, like when I'm working on these abstract pieces, when it finally clicks, you know, it takes a lot of time to find pieces that make the dialogue that clicks. And that's also satisfaction. It's frustration and then it's satisfaction when it works. So I think that would those would be some of the highlights. As a textile artist, do you find that the art world has been slow or resistant to showing your work because of the medium itself? That old high versus low art dichotomy. Definitely. There's a viewpoint, it tends to be that what's traditionally a woman's craft, woman's work is viewed as craft versus fine art. So there's that craft fine art dichotomy. Um, I'm I do show work in an art gallery, and lately, and I feel very fortunate in the last few years. Besides exhibiting in art quilt shows, I'm exhibiting in shows next to a painting or a photograph. But it's like when I had a group of art critics that I knew look at some work, and one was from a street market in France, and it had purses in it, and they were saying, if it was a painting, it's definitely fine art, but they aren't sure because it's in textiles. And I think textiles are gaining more and more acceptance in the fine art world. You're seeing them at the Whitney, at different museums in New York. They're in the art shows, Basel. And so they're gaining much more acceptance. And so I feel in part I'm transforming. You usually think of fabrics and sewing and women as a sweatshop. And I think and the sewing machine is in the back room. So I kind of feel I'm moving it to the front room. And so it's also a feminist statement. But there definitely is an issue, and there's often, discussion, craft, and art. And that's frustrating as an artist. And I tend to say just I'm an artist, not a fabric artist, just as you don't hear painters say, I'm a painting artist, I'm an oil paint artist. But people, I think, are slowly getting exposed to textiles as art. But that's why it's wonderful when they're in shows where it's not art quilters only who are seeing them, but it's the general public or being exposed as they are, hopefully tonight, and when the show comes to the university. Do I start out knowing where you want to go or where you think you want to go? Oh, do you let your mind take you there? It sometimes depends on the piece. The the abstract freeform ones you saw, I sometimes would draw out a shape. They never came out anything like it. Um, they take a life of their own. I find by starting with a piece that I like in fabric, that sparks something that gets me going. I've also found it interesting. I tend to keep scraps, which means it's hard to throw things out because I've often found when I cut pieces out free form, they tend to be the same. They're my calligraphy, they're my mark making. So I find the remnants are sometimes more interesting than the piece I cut out. But what's left, I find more exciting. The wall pieces, I didn't know what I would do when I came home from my visit to Poland. I knew I wanted to do something, and I mulled for months over it. And then it slowly came together what I would do. So it depends on the piece. The peacock, I guess I decided I want to do a peacock, and I was working with things that dissolve in water, which is how I was able to put those fine brocades together. And there I did do a pattern of sorts. I didn't know exactly how each feather would turn out, but I started playing with color. So it depends on the piece. See, the next question is, what was my formal training in art? How did that inform your work over the course of your career? Well, I definitely took art classes in college, but then I felt I needed to earn a living. So I went to law school and I practiced law for many years. And then when I was able to work part-time, I took more art classes at schools at Otis College of Art, and I did painting, pastels. They weren't classes with fabric, but I'd always worked with fabric, and I started making some traditional quilts, and I don't like to follow patterns, so mine got to be my own freeform work. And then what I liked about art quilts is allowed me to paint. I sometimes paint on canvas, then I stitch. Some of my quilts combine painting. So I liked the ability to express myself via different mediums. And so I kind of work both sides of the brain. So sometimes I'm very logical, but I like the other side of my brain to go to work.
You have a question in the chat box. With so many colors and textures, how do you organize your studio?
I was very lucky to, when one of my sons moved out, we turned his room and enlarged it into a studio. The understanding was that I would remove my stores of fabric from the garage and all the cupboards all over the house. And I tend to organize, well, I mainly have cottons, and I generally organize by color. And I can tell I do not usually use browns, because I was looking for a brown today. And so I sort in one area where they're more monotone, tone on tone, or mainly blues or blues and blues or blues and green, or mainly pinks, pinks and red. And then in other cupboards, I kind of sort by pattern in a way. I kind of have children's things or novelty prints of objects together. And then I will keep stripes together. And others that seem to me to go together, whether they're more just wild pop art, or if they're more florals, or if they're more Japanese. But, I happen to have resorted it, I guess, maybe during lockdown now. And I always find pieces that are hidden away. And I have a certain way of folding them so that I can see them and pull them out. And then I have other bins for where I put my fancier fabrics that are just more, I put those in a different location, and it seems to work. And then I have bins of scraps. So, and felt, and I sometimes paint cheesecloth. So, and now I see the next question is, I've seen a design wall when people are creating art quilts. Is that how you create your quilts? That's exactly true. I have two big 4x8 pieces of, I forgot whatever construction board that I got from insulation from Home Depot, that are covered with white flannel, and fabric will stick to it. So I work on that, or depending what I'm doing, I will pin up batting on it, and then the fabric will stick to the batting, because otherwise, if I do a freeform abstract on the flannel and it's 30, 40, 50 pieces. It's hard to transport it and make it so that I can sew them down. And when I'm working on the fiberglass mesh as backgrounds, I pin that to the design wall, and then I will pin pieces on it once they're firmly placed so that I can move it and sew on it, and not necessarily layer on it. Quilts now, for quilt exhibits, they don't require now 3 layers of fabric. It can be something that represents 3 layers. So it could be, wood, wire, plastic. There's become much more freedom in the art world in that respect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with us. We're really excited to have you. I can't wait to have your work on campus and unroll it and see it in person. And I hope everyone that's listening can come to the gallery and see this. It's coming March. Sorry, I have to cheat and look at my board. March the 26th is when this exhibition opens. So please do come see this. You have one more question. What are you working on now?
I just finished the piece that I showed at the end that was different shapes, a very open piece that's on the fiberglass mesh. And actually right now I am making a charity quilt, a children's quilt. I always like to make a few a year, and they get donated to shelters or hospitals. I must admit, I've found it hard. I have not done that much creative work during COVID. I found that it is hard on my creativity. I think probably the stress. So this piece, well, maybe also, it's darker. A friend looked at it and thought it represented the times of being, it was kind of dark and intense. It's not meant to be that, but I'm finding it harder to work, my creatively. So it's been a good time to do some of these children's quilts. And I found how there's movement, as I said, from traditional to freeform, from the Peacock to the freeform abstract to this, and I kind of wonder where it will take me next. But I like to experiment, and I'm not sure where I'm going. So I kind of doing this baby quilt is kind of a filler, but it's still challenging as I don't really follow a pattern, and I'm still, picking something and what fabric goes with it. So it's not a traditional baby quilt. And I was asked to make one to donate for, it's a legal aid fundraising group, and that it'll be at auction. So it'll go for legal aid. So I feel it's also going for a good cause.
Thank you again, Sandra. It was so lovely meeting you and talking to you, and I can't wait to have your work on campus next year.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me.
So we want to, again, invite you to the galleries. If you haven't been to the galleries this semester, we're intensely engaged in some of the bigger social issues of the day, as we always are. Right now we have our Veterans Show, which seeks to really make the public aware about the struggles that veterans are going through, and the kinds of sacrifices they make, the kinds of sacrifices their families make. In the spring semester, when we bring the show on refugees, different artists will have responded in Textiles, as Sandra Lauterbach did. There's going to be it's going to be really hard for me to not touch stuff because the works are very powerful. As any images that you might have seen on the news are depicted in textile form, and we'll be bringing some of our other artists back to talk about the losses, the gains, and our responsibilities as citizens of the world and as of the Misericordia community, what we can do to really advance the cause of justice for those who are not able to speak out for themselves. So with that, if you don't have any other comments, we'll end this, but please do come in the galleries and let Dr. Carmack know, or send an email to me, llittle@misericordia.edu, about what other things that we can bring to your attention and supplement your classes with, as far as real world experiences, engagements in the world. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for supporting the arts at Misericordia University. Everyone have a wonderful night.